Absolutely. We will make buses free by replacing the revenue that the MTA currently gets from buses. This is revenue that's around $700 million or so. That's less money than Andrew Cuomo gave to Elon Musk in $959 million in tax credits when he was the governor.
Every single day, New York City's bus system collects almost $2 million from riders. Over the course of a year, that adds up to about $700 million coming directly from bus fares. Now imagine that number suddenly dropping to zero. Because one proposal currently being debated in New York City would do exactly that, make buses completely free. No fare, no MetroCard, just step on and ride. In a city where a single bus trip costs $2.90 and housing can reach several $1,000s a month, it's easy to understand why that promise immediately grabs attention. But when a system this large changes how it's funded, the numbers quickly become impossible to ignore. New York operates more than 5,800 buses, moving over 1 million riders on a typical weekday across hundreds of routes.
And the reason that we will do so is that making buses free doesn't just provide economic relief, but also public safety.
And the broader MTA network handles around 5 to 6 million passenger trips every single day, making it one of the busiest transit systems anywhere in the world. At that scale, even a single policy change can reshape how transportation is funded across the entire city. So if buses stop collecting fares, the question isn't just whether riders save money. The real question is simple: where does the $700 million go? Because that money currently helps keep the system running, paying drivers, maintaining vehicles, and supporting daily operations across a massive transit network. And if it disappears from the fare box, it doesn't disappear from the budget. It has to come from somewhere else.
Because what we've seen is that it decreases assaults on bus drivers by 38.9%. New Yorkers deserve more than the slowest buses in the country. I know that because I was on the M57 not too long ago, and its average speed is 4.9 miles an hour.
We're at time, though, but the question is how you'll make them free.
Spread across the calendar, that missing revenue equals roughly $1.9 million every single day that would have to be replaced from another part of the city's finances. To understand the size of that number, it helps to put it in context. $700 million is roughly comparable to what New York City spends maintaining its entire park system. From Central Park to neighborhood playgrounds across the 5 boroughs, it's also in the same range as the annual budgets of major city services responsible for keeping streets clean and infrastructure running. In other words, this isn't a small line item that can quietly disappear. It's a massive piece of the city's financial puzzle that would require a clear replacement plan.
We will fund the revenue that would have otherwise been brought in from fares, and that's something that we would do in partnership with Albany, and I've put forward 2 proposals. The first is to raise taxes on the top 1% of New Yorkers by 2%. That would raise $4 billion. The second is to raise the state's top corporate tax rate to match that of New Jersey, which would raise $5 billion.
We're going to move along, but I just want to point out to viewers that Governor Hochul has opposed raising the income tax.
A commitment like this doesn't simply slide into the budget. It reshapes priorities across agencies that are already competing for the same pool of public funding. New York City's total budget is well over $100 billion, with dozens of departments relying on those funds to operate every day. So when supporters of fare-free transit suggest the city budget could absorb the cost, what they're really describing is a significant reshuffling of resources inside one of the largest municipal budgets in the world. And we're not talking about a minor accounting adjustment. A shift of this size would likely trigger serious budget negotiations across multiple departments, because hundreds of millions of dollars would suddenly need to be redirected somewhere else in the financial plan. Another possible path leads through Albany, where state leaders often play a role in transit funding. But the relationship between the state and long-term MTA funding has been complicated over the years. A recent example still stands out. The congestion pricing program was designed to create a dedicated stream of revenue for transit improvements, and early estimates suggested it could generate around $1 billion per year for the system. Yet when the plan became politically controversial, it was paused before fully taking effect. That left transit planners adjusting their expectations after projects had already been discussed. Because of moments like that, some analysts say relying on long-term state support for a new $700 million annual commitment would likely face careful scrutiny. There's also another option sometimes discussed when transit funding gaps appear: new taxes tied specifically to transportation. These proposals can take several forms, including payroll-based contributions, targeted levies on businesses operating in major transit zones, or additional charges on higher income brackets. But policies like that come with their own ripple effects. Businesses may reassess operating costs. High-earning professionals might reconsider where they live or work, and the same tax base expected to support a major new transit program is also the one economists already monitor closely for long-term stability. New York City has more than 8 million residents and one of the largest urban economies in the world. When policy changes happen inside a system that large, even relatively small adjustments can move through the economy in ways that are difficult to predict. That's where the balancing act becomes complicated. There's also the operational side of the equation. If buses suddenly become free and replacement funding doesn't fully keep pace, ridership could climb quickly as more people choose buses for daily travel. Increased usage would signal strong demand, but it would also require the system to keep service frequent, reliable, and properly staffed. And this isn't just theoretical. In many cities where fare-free transit has been introduced, ridership does increase. That's often one of the goals. But when ridership grows on a system that hasn't expanded its capacity, the overall experience doesn't automatically improve. Instead, it can mean more passengers sharing the same buses, the same routes, and the same schedules that were already under pressure. And in New York, the scale of that pressure is enormous. The broader MTA network handles roughly 5 to 6 million passenger trips on a typical weekday across buses and subways combined, the equivalent of moving the population of a large city through a transit system every single day. New Yorkers already know what a crowded transit system can feel like: a bus arriving later than expected, already packed with riders, and barely any space left. Removing the fare doesn't automatically change that situation overnight. If demand rises faster than service improvements, the system can become even more stretched, and the riders who depend on buses the most are often the first to feel those pressures. That's where the discussion becomes more complicated. Supporters of fare-free transit emphasize the potential relief for residents facing rising living costs. Transportation analysts, however, often point out that service quality matters just as much as affordability. If ridership grows significantly, planners would likely need to expand routes, increase frequency, and support a system that is already operating on a very large scale. And the financial adjustments behind changes like this rarely arrive with a headline. When a service becomes free at the point of use, the cost doesn't disappear. It simply moves somewhere else in the system. At the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars each year, that redistribution can ripple through the broader city economy, affecting people who may rarely or never ride the bus. To understand that scale, consider the size of the city itself. New York has more than 3 million housing units and over 8 million residents. When costs shift within a system that large, even relatively small adjustments can quietly affect millions of households. Imagine a landlord in the Bronx facing a higher property tax bill tied to broader budget changes. That increase may not stay with the property owner for long. Over time, it could appear in the next lease renewal. A tenant, possibly the same person using the bus, might save $2.90 on a daily commute, but face higher monthly housing costs later on. And in a city where average rents in many neighborhoods already reach several $1,000s per month, even small increases can outweigh those savings. There's another part of the conversation that transit analysts often point to. Each year, the MTA loses a significant amount of potential revenue from riders who enter buses without paying the fare. Estimates from transit officials suggest the total impact across buses and subways can reach hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Supporters of fare-free transit sometimes argue that removing fares would eliminate that issue entirely. If there is no fare to pay, there is nothing to bypass. In that sense, a free system could remove one of the challenges transit agencies currently face, but the change would also reshape how the entire system is funded. Today, public transportation relies on a mixed model, combining rider fares with government support from city and state budgets. Across the broader network, the MTA collects billions of dollars in fare revenue each year from buses and subways combined. Moving to a fully tax-funded system would shift that balance dramatically. Instead of relying partly on riders, transit funding would depend far more on public budgets and the political decisions that shape them. And those priorities can change over time. Budget pressures, economic slowdowns, or shifting policy goals can all influence how funding is allocated. In a system as large as New York's, that makes long-term financial planning a complicated equation. There's another angle that sometimes enters the conversation as well. If buses were to become free and the policy gained broad support, a natural question could follow. What about the subway system? And that's where the scale changes dramatically. While buses generate hundreds of millions in fares each year, the subway network brings in several billion dollars annually from riders. Extending the same idea to trains would mean replacing a far larger share of the system's funding. The system itself is enormous. New York's subway network includes 472 stations and hundreds of miles of track, making it one of the largest and busiest transit systems anywhere in the world. Even if expanding fare-free transit beyond buses isn't part of the current proposal, the broader question still comes up in policy discussions. Once one part of a transit system removes fares, some observers believe pressure can build to apply the same approach elsewhere. That's why some residents want to understand where the long-term direction could lead before the first step is taken. Supporters of the proposal, however, argue that easier access to transportation can bring real benefits. Public transit is often described as a public good that connects people to jobs, healthcare services, and educational opportunities. Lowering barriers to transportation can help residents move through the city more easily, and several cities around the world have experimented with fare-free transit with meaningful results. Those ideas are not fringe perspectives. They are part of an ongoing policy discussion about how cities fund and operate public transportation. In a place like New York, where millions of residents rely on transit every day, improving access to transportation is often seen as closely tied to economic opportunity. At the same time, analysts frequently point out that New York operates at a very different scale than most places that have experimented with fare-free transit. The MTA system handles roughly 5 to 6 million passenger trips on a typical weekday across buses and subways combined, making it one of the busiest transit networks anywhere in the world. Because of that scale, even relatively small policy changes can carry large financial implications. Any major shift in how the system is funded would likely require careful planning, long-term financial support, and extensive debate before becoming reality. And history adds another layer to the discussion. Transit funding in New York has often involved ambitious proposals followed by delays or adjustments when budget pressure appears. Many residents have seen that cycle play out more than once, which is why new proposals often raise questions about how reliably long-term funding could be maintained. Still, the word free carries a powerful emotional pull. In a city where everyday expenses continue to climb, it's easy to understand why that promise attracts attention. When a single bus ride costs $2.90 and housing in many neighborhoods can reach several $1,000s per month, even small savings can feel meaningful. The frustration behind that reaction is real, and the affordability concerns many residents feel are very real as well. New York City is home to more than 8 million people, and millions rely on public transportation every day to get to work, school, and essential services. In a city where everyday expenses continue to climb, it's not surprising that the promise of free transit immediately captures attention. At the same time, New York has a long history of costs appearing in less obvious ways. Sometimes the financial impact of a policy doesn't show up during the initial announcement. Instead, it emerges later through budget adjustments, tax changes, or shifting spending priorities that don't always carry the same headline. A recent transit funding debate offers a useful example. When congestion pricing was paused before fully launching, the decision was framed as a temporary adjustment. but the financial planning around major transit projects still had to adapt afterward. The program had originally been expected to generate around $1 billion per year for improvements across the system. Situations like that illustrate how quickly funding expectations can shift when economic or policy conditions change. That's why conversations about fare-free buses often return to the same central question. The system currently collects about $700 million in bus fares each year, nearly $2 million every single day. If that revenue disappears, it would still need to be replaced somewhere within the broader financial structure supporting transit. At the same time, higher ridership could place additional pressure on a network that already moves millions of passengers every day. And in a system as large and complex as New York's, even relatively small policy changes can ripple across operations, budgets, and long-term planning. For residents following the debate, the key question isn't just whether buses could become free, it's understanding where the costs would ultimately land and how the city's broader transit system would adapt. Because in a network that moves millions of people every day, even a single policy change can shape how one of the largest transit systems in the world is funded for years to come.